Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons. Been a minute since I've been up, so needed to put together a couple of videos I've been meaning to do for a while now. And I've got a response slash reaction to the RPG Pundit that I need to get done about story gaming, but I've been feeling massively under the weather here the past little bit. And so I'm going to start off by taking a look at our friends over at Dragon Dreams and why not 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, why he doesn't play 5e. Now, most people who don't play 5e don't play 5e for kind of the same reasons that RPG Pundit was going off about story gaming. And I have some thoughts on that. And I don't think that using tabletop role-playing games as a vessel for narrative storytelling is much of an issue. But these storytelling games, such as Candela Obscura, Daggerheart, and really anything powered by the apocalypse, they're very, very limited in their scope because they're not meant to be games. But we're going to see what Dragon Dreams has to say about 5e. On the 280ZX, I got the clutch up and running, which was awesome. But unfortunately, turns out the starter decided to conk out on me at that time. So instead of us having a reveal video of me driving the car out and moving it to its new home, I'm unfortunately going to have to shell out some money and get my hands on a starter and make some videos about replacing the starter before we get to that point. But for now, we're going to move on and we're going to look at why Dragon Dream says he is not doing 5e.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about why I do not like 5e and why I don't play it. So, first of all, number one, it's corporate. I mean, Hasbro is a corporation. They own Wizards of the Coast. And this corporation is completely profit driven, 100%. I mean, the only goal of a corporation is profit. So they don't really fundamentally care about the game. They don't really fundamentally care about the players and about the hobby. When D&D was first invented, it was invented by these two guys, Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, who were really, really into this particular hobby, first of all, through tactics games. And then they were developing really what was a new game. And they developed it out of love and passion. Now, when they went over to TSR, TSR, of course, was a for-profit business, but it's not a big mega corporation like Hasbro. In other words, and the people that were in it were still people who loved the game. So it was, Gary Gygax was still writing a lot of the books up until one of the late 80s or whatever when he was kicked out. Number two.
Okay, so starting right off the bat, this is one that I absolutely hate. Oh, corporate. Yeah, corporations are there to make profit. They are there to make profit for their shareholders. They are a vessel for collective groups to get together and work as a team to put out a product and to formalize the agreement to share the project, and also to create a liability structure to where the individual members of the corporation are not liable for negligence and other things that happen on part of the corporation. It allows for collective ownership, which allows for greater growth in the business industry of the business itself. And what I think he's failing to put here, first off, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson made Dungeons and Dragons and Chainmail to make money. They came together because they felt that they had a niche, a new way of looking at wargaming that could make them money. They founded TSR. They built a corporation to make money. Gary Gygax, very early in the history of TSR, was immediately out, not writing books, but trying to get movie deals and stuff like that in California. And he got run out of TSR. And if I'm not mistaken, he actually got run out in the early 80s, not in the late 80s. And the idea that TSR was, people who love the game and stuff. Yeah, there were a lot of great people like Margaret Weiss and Tracy and Laura Hickman and Greenwood and various others that were big pillars of the industry, and definitely were people who loved playing the games and had more of a passion for it than some of the newer designers. But it was still a corporation that was run for the purpose of producing a product to make money. And TSR, I hate to tell it to a lot of the OSR guys, but TSR made some far more damaging and just horrendous decisions for the hobby itself and for the health of the game than Wizards of the Coast did. I mean, up until recently, Wizards of the Coast has recently woke themselves to death. But the decisions and a lot of the choices that were made and a lot of the business decisions made by TSR were far worse than Wizards of the Coast. They almost completely killed Dungeons and Dragons trying to push the kind of stuff they were doing. And that's to say nothing of the bringing in Buck Rogers and all that nonsense. It being corporate is not a reason to not play. Because first off, D&D has always been corporate. It always has been. It's been a corporate game from day one. And now he does have a little kind of seed of truth that makes it a solid reason, that is a solid reason. And that is that when Hasbro acquired Wizards of the Coast and the way they've staffed it and the people that they put in charge of it, is they have taken it away from a product to a management and licensing model. No longer are these people here trying to innovate in the gaming space. They're going to hire designers. They're going to hire people who have a passion for the game to put together mechanics and stuff. But they're going to do two things. One, they're going to push their DEI, equity investing culture that they've got. And two, they're really going to try and streamline, par things down to what can we get the most broad mass market appeal. We don't care about grognards in their basement. We care about mama who has no idea what Wizards of the Coast has done, doesn't even know what Wizards of the Coast is, but buys these books for her kid for their birthday because their kids want to get into this game because they heard about this Dungeons and Dragons game. And that's what they care about. And they are going to move away from the more serious hobbyists and players in that pursuit. But, and that is, don't get me wrong, that does make a detriment to the product. But, it's a corporate game. This is a non-issue. You've always been playing a corporate game. And if you pick up Pathfinder, that's a corporate game. And if you pick up Call of Cthulhu, that's a corporate game. Mongoose Traveler is a corporate game. These are all corporations. They are all mid-sized corporations. And just because they're not all publicly traded does not mean that they aren't corporate entities.
Two, it's too easy. First of all, there's this 3 saving throws in order to die rule, which pretty clearly makes it difficult to die, almost impossible to die. There are people apparently who have tried to make bad decisions in 5e to see how long their character would live, and their character just wouldn't die. So that's obviously very easy. And if you're not convinced by that, there's also this hit point bump, where in basic D&D, the hit points were either D4, D6, or D8 per level. Then in AD&D 1 and 2E, the hit points were usually either D4, D6, D8, or D10 for hit dice. And then in 5E, it's either D6, D8, D10, or D12. So, and there's a rule that's official now that you have a max hit points at first level. That was always an optional rule. So all that should tell you it's too easy. 3,
Okay, it's too easy. This is, if you're just going to play rules as written, I guess you could say that. Death saving throws, that's optional. Hit points can be adjusted. Yes, the game has much higher hit points, but the game also has much higher damage outputs. If anything, the game is just a lot more swingy. Now, I'm not here to defend 5e. By the way the rules are written in the basic game, it is substantially more, the characters are substantially more durable. And that's because they've moved from a epic or like a sword and sorcery style fantasy game that is supposed to have those fear of death and death defying stunts and getting out by the skin of your teeth and that real hard edge to it. They've replaced it with a heroic fantasy game that's more like medieval fantasy Avengers, where everybody's a superhero. And the way I've always put it is, and the real split started at third edition. The way I've always put it, early Dungeons and Dragons, you started off as like a foot soldier, and you were a regular, well-trained foot soldier. You weren't just a commoner. You weren't just somebody who didn't know what they were doing, but you had the basic level of training, and you were starting off on your career, and you had the same kind of life expectancy of somebody who was a basic level person. When you get to third edition and higher, and especially in fifth edition, your character starts off as an elite level person. So if you say, I'm a wrestler, for instance, so we're just going to say I'm a wrestler, I'm a grappler. A first level wrestler in Dungeons and Dragons, fifth edition, third edition, fourth edition, is like an Olympic caliber athlete. This is somebody who's already competing in the world games and challenging for a medal. By the time they're fifth level, they are they're a monster who's undefeatable. And by the time they're 10th level, they've surpassed anything that we would see in the real world in terms of their abilities. So starting off at level 1, you're already a world games competitor. Whereas in the original Dungeons and Dragons and second edition, to a lesser extent, if you had a wrestler character, a first level wrestler is like the guy who competed in high school and maybe is going to, Division 1 as just a competitor. You're way back within the normal human parameters for somebody who's had significant training. So if you like a heroic fantasy game, of course the characters are a bit more durable. 5e has taken it to a ridiculous extent. 3 death saves, just 14 different ways. Death is never permanent, 14 different ways resurrected. And that's because when you got to 4th and 5th edition, they started copying video games. And look at what video games have gone from. We've gone from quarter eaters that were going to kill you repeatedly and give you limited continues because they were meant to be played in an arcade where you would have to keep putting in quarters, to autosave features that save your game every 10 steps. So if you get killed, you just go back to your last autosave and you've lost 2 minutes worth of time. And that's the mentality. That kind of touches back on the whole it's corporate thing. They did it for mass appeal because that is going to appeal to more of the overall gamer player base, not the hardcore people, not the people who've been here since the beginning, not the role-playing game crowd, but the general generic player base who may have never picked up a die, who were used to plug it in their PlayStation. But let's see what he's got about
3. It's a storytelling game and has been, I think, ever since Wizards of the Coast bought the IP. Before then, I'm going to stick my neck out there and say it was not a storytelling game. It was either a tactical game of dungeon crawling and that kind of a thing, or it was a epic heroic quest simulation game. It was one of those two to whoever was playing it, and often a combination. But a storytelling game is something very different in my not so humble opinion. So a storytelling game is more like you are there to tell a story. You're participating in telling a story, and you want it to be a good story. And so it's more about role-playing your character and drama, not just role-playing, but dramatizing your character for the group. Doing things that your character would do, even if those are bad things, like even if those are tragic or something like that. there is this game from 1995, I believe, called Everway. It was a card-based, storytelling-based role-playing game. It had no mechanics to speak of at all. You had ability scores that were the 4 elements, and they were numeric, and that was the only numbers you had in the whole game, and the numbers were supposed to be interpreted by the GM. The GM interpreted what happened through the medium of these things were sort of like tarot cards, and basically just interpreted what the pictures meant. There was no specified meaning to any of these cards. I think they had names like drowning in armor and pictures, and that's it. Now, this is a storytelling game by contrast to Dungeons and Dragons. Now, guess who made Everway? Wizards of the Coast. I still have it. I think it's a great game as far as a storytelling game is concerned. Unfortunately, it flopped. It was shortly after that that Wizards of the Coast bought Dungeons and Dragons. And my not so humble opinion is that they bought the Dungeons and Dragons IP so that they could make a storytelling game like Everway, but that they wanted a popular brand.
All right. I think he's got a little bit more to say on that, but there's a lot to unpack. First off is his timelines are off. The Hickman Revolution with second edition started in the early 80s. That is when Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing game in general started to move away from simulationist dungeon crawling into fantasy storytelling games. Now, there is a bit of a debate there when you start saying storytelling games. And I do think that the RPG Pundit actually has a good dividing line in the way he says it. There is a difference between a narrative game or a narrative adventure game, narrative role-playing game versus having narrative storytelling within your role-playing game and using a role-playing game as the basis for narrative storytelling versus an actual storytelling game. And I think that's a good definition to use because Dungeons and Dragons is not a storytelling game. It's not. Even 5th edition, which is the closest one to a storytelling game, is not a storytelling game. One of the big problems is they keep trying to make it one or pretend like it's one, and then the rules and the mechanics of the game get in the way. Now, every edition of Dungeons and Dragons, they scale back the rules, they simplify things, they make it more about interpretation by the DM, and they simplify things to the point that it makes it easier to manipulate in favor of the story, which makes it more of a storytelling game. Like when you get to things like Daggerheart or Candela Obscura, where there's basically no damn rules except for Game Master make it up to make the story work, which is a storytelling game. Dungeons and Dragons, since second edition, has been a narrative. It has had a narrative focus on all of its publicly produced materials. And that's why they called it the Hickman Revolution. It started with Tracy and Laura Hickman moving away from things like Tomb of Horrors and Keep on the Borderlands and Village of Hamlet and Temple of Elemental Evil, which are just straight up dungeon crawls that have nothing to them other than there's monsters, go kill them, collect the gold, come back, pay for your XP, level your character up, and moved them towards things like Ravenloft that is very narratively driven. And I think you can say that third, fourth, and fifth edition are far more focused on narrative-driven gaming than they are simulationism or just dungeon crawling or mechanical gaming is what you could call it. But they haven't quite passed over into story gaming as he's put forth here. So he says it's in his not so humble opinion, and in my not so humble opinion, I think he's just dead wrong on that one. Fifth edition is far more of a storytelling game than, say, third edition or second edition or first edition, but it still has core backbone mechanics that are solid enough to run a regular role-playing game. Wizards of the Coast has done a lot to try and damage that, as the storytelling revolution has kind of started with things like Critical Role, and a lot of their supplements par back the strength and the rigidity of those rules and make it more of a storytelling game, but it's still not a storytelling game.
And the problem I have with 5e is that if it's a storytelling game, the rules are all wrong. It's not just there's too many of them, because you don't need very many rules for a storytelling game. It's that there are rules that are not necessary for a storytelling game, like hit points, armor class, to hit, the entire combat system. If you take out the entire combat system, much of the class benefits go away. If you take out the combat system, much of the purpose of magic goes away. Monster fighting is a really important part of a heroic adventure simulation. It's not an important part necessarily of a storytelling game, except so far as you might narrate out how the battle goes.
He just kind of put the lie to his own point. Like you said, 5th edition has way too many rules, way too many mechanics to be a true storytelling game. That's it right there, because it's not a storytelling game. It is a role-playing game system, a tabletop role-playing system that has been scaled back, pared down, and adapted to be far more narrative-focused than mechanic-focused. It has not crossed that line into being a storytelling game, which is part of the reason why I think 5th edition is starting to sour a lot. I mean, aside from all the other crap that Wizards of the Coast has done when it comes to things like Pinkerton scandals and just other horrific PR moves that they've made, each new edition, each new book that comes out, first off, power creep was never a D&D thing until you got Wizards of the Coast involved, and that's because power creep is their business model with Magic the Gathering. But you had the core tabletop role-playing game group and your simulationists and your people who became your OSR, who were just almost outright offended by 5th edition. You know, they were already outright offended by 4th edition, and they came back to give 5th edition a shot and were like, absolutely not, this is garbage, because it was too pared down. So what Wizards did is they pivoted and they said, hey, we got to get more of these storytelling people. So you got all your new players coming in, and they're trying to go to gather, because they pissed off that hardcore, hardcore is the wrong word. They've pissed off that mechanic-focused base already, so they're going to start trying to move towards the storytelling side. And that side has kind of tried to embrace them, but they are starting to sour on D&D for a lot of reasons. One, because your storytelling group tends to be politically one direction. They tend to be very leftist. They tend to be extremely like socially woke, and everything that Wizards does and very anti-corporate, everything Wizards does to piss them off is going to make them run away. And like he said, a storytelling game doesn't really need a lot of rules. So they're already playing 5th edition and throwing out half the rules anyway, or only using them when they're convenient. They can very easily go to a game that has even fewer rules and even weaker systems. So they don't need Dungeons and Dragons. So as 5th edition sours on them, Wizards of the Coast is going to lose that customer base. However, the game does not have strong enough foundations for the mechanically minded groups. Your power gamers are not 5th edition gamers. Your dungeon divers are not 5th edition gamers. Most of them are going to be OSR, and if they're not OSR, they're going to be 3rd edition.
So it's more about creating an interesting battle, maybe, than creating a tactical battle. But that's not what Dungeons and Dragons 5e has. It has a tactical combat system. But it's a tactical combat system where it's almost impossible to die. I think that they have a storytelling game with completely mismatched rules. Number 4. it rolled back a couple of things that I think were very important to a lot of us. One was that in all the earlier versions of the game, it always said, this game is yours to change as you want. If you are the DM, you can make homebrews, house rules, you can change everything around, you can use different dice, whatever. So it was always meant to be this open-ended game. And the reason for that is if you look into like the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, there is an explanation of this, which is that Dave Arneson and friends got this idea from a 1890s war strategy game that was actually created for the US military called Strategos. And Strategos had this concept that there is a referee who would uh, adjudicate real life, sort of realistic situations. So let's say your soldiers were on a hex that had a farmhouse on it, and there's a river that they can't cross to get at the enemy. They might ask the referee, what would be the mechanics for my soldiers on this hex to take apart the barn and put together a bridge to go over the river so I could get at the enemy? And then the referee would come up with something that was supposed to be realistic. And the concept of this is that that would give an authentic simulation of war to train officers. Dave Arneson got a hold of this and really loved this whole concept of having this referee who could step in and adjudicate things, which means that the moves that players make open up infinitely because you no longer are bound by the rules you can make by the mechanics of the game. You can think creatively and realistically in order to come up with ideas that don't have mechanics for them in the game. That was a critical part of Dungeons and Dragons, and it was critical all the way from its beginnings, 1974, through the 90s. Okay, and that sense to it of rulings over rules has been rolled back considerably to the point where apparently there's some verbiage about it somewhere in, I think, the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, but it is really buried. Apparently, I didn't think it was there, honestly, until I got on debate with somebody on Facebook, and they actually, quoted me chapter and verse on it, and I stood corrected, and I was like, okay, so they did say something, but the guy admitted, yeah, but they really, really buried it. Okay, and so to me, that cuts right at the heart of what a TTRPG is, not just what Dungeons and Dragons is, because Dave Arneson invented the TTRPG. He invented role-playing games, okay, of any kind. And one of the key ingredients, what really makes a TTRPG is this rule of a referee from Strategos. So that is fundamental. And I think it's fundamental because what we really want, at least the people from my day, I think really want in a TTRPG is a heroic quest simulation. And a simulation means you might fail. It's like I love playing Dungeons and Dragons, that is old school Dungeons and Dragons, because I love finding out if I have it in me to be a hero. I want to be that knight in shining armor and be like, hey, can I slay a dragon? And so I feel like they really kind of took out that sense of it and took a lot of power away from the dungeon master and almost ruled things so much that one almost wonders if the dungeon master is even really needed to play it. And
okay, so I think he's definitely off base on this one. Now, if he were making this complaint against 3rd edition or 3.5, I'd be right there. Now, I love 3.5, but 3.5 was the crunchiest of the crunchy. If it didn't have a ruling for it or a rule for it in the beginning, there were supplements that were made for it later. There were rules for absolutely everything in 3.5, to the point where it can be really obnoxious if you're a game master for a 3.5 group and you have somebody who's a true power gamer in there, and you're like, hey, I'm going to make this ruling, and then they'll spout off that some obscure splat book that came out in 2008, right towards the end of third edition, has a specific way that that type of rule is supposed to work, or that situation is supposed to be handled. And you have to go back and say, well, yeah, but the Dungeon Master's Guide also says that the DM has the final say. So 3.5 was far crunchier and had far more rules. Fifth edition, if anything, scaled that back tremendously and left a lot more open to the game master. Now, what they did do, and I'm not going to talk culturally here, I'm going to talk mechanically here. One thing that they did do is they simplified the rules to the point where the rulings don't have as much flavor, they're not as expansive, they don't have as much versatility as they did before. Because they'll say things like, oh, well, you get advantage or disadvantage. That's a solid single mechanic. Not, oh, you can get +2, +3, +5, +10 to that. You can get -2, -5, -10 to that. Not, you have to use these checks in concert to get these, you'll get this much advantage doing it this way. You came up with this great idea, so we're going to adjust that. Can you do that in 5th edition? Sure. But that is not mechanically how the game is set up. The game is mechanically set up for, okay, you get advantage. Maybe you get double advantage. You get disadvantage. So they didn't get rid of rulings over rules. They didn't even really scale it back. If anything, they enhanced rulings over rules from 3rd edition to 5th edition. But what they did is they simplified the system down to the point where making those rulings is not nearly as impactful or as precise as it was in previous editions.
And number 5. 5e to me feels like a video game, not a fantasy simulation. I think in the old days we were simulating either folklore or myth, or fairy tales, Arthurian legends, definitely fantasy fiction. Tolkien style fantasy fiction can be really felt in there, as well as sword and sorcery. And so I think that there's a sense in 5e though that it's feels more like a video game than an authentic simulation of a fantasy story. Because I think most of the classes have spells. Those that don't have sort of like special moves you can only use a certain amount of times per day or something like that. And it sort of comes off as kind of video game-ish to me, because that's often how video games are. It doesn't really make sense. It's not really realistic. It doesn't really feel organic to me as a fantasy story, but it's kind of like in a video game, it sort of works, or in a computer role-playing game, it kind of works because you need some kind of mechanics, because it's just the computer arbitrating what's going on. And so all the rules need to be completely and utterly nailed down, which is why computer role-playing games are so different from tabletop role-playing games.
Absolutely, he's 100% right on this one. It is very much like a video game. And that's because that's who Hasbro has targeted. Hasbro basically looked and said, video games are super popular. How do we tap into the gamer geek culture? How do we tap into the video game culture? 4th edition was way worse about this than 5th edition. 4th edition was so video gamey that it basically didn't work. It was really not a very good system at all. And they said, okay, we went too far into the video game. We need to back up and go back to the tabletop game so that we need to be a little bit closer here. We over adjusted. But yeah, 5th edition, like I said, it's almost like autosave. That's kind of what your death saves are. The extreme ease for resurrections and getting your character back and that sort of thing. It's really set up like a modern video game, to where if you fail, it's just a temporary setback, as opposed to if you fail, it's game over.
So, and that, to me, that is artificial. It takes away from simulating fantasy and then becomes more like a computer game with bad graphics, and that doesn't have any graphics. So in conclusion, what I really got involved with TTRPGs for is that I wanted to have the experience in a game of going on an epic quest and kind of seeing, can I be a hero? Can I slay the dragon? And that requires a tactical game, one in which moves matter, in which there's a chance that my character might die. And when my character survives and slays that dragon, boy, does it feel good. Okay, by contrast, I think a storytelling game is something very different. And so I think what's going on here, the game got taken over by people who are just totally profit oriented. They're just, they don't really care about the original players. They didn't really care enough to even make a good storytelling game. It's a storytelling game that has bad rules for a storytelling game. It has tactical simulationist rules, they didn't really care enough about the tactical side to make it worth playing because it's too hard to die. And they didn't really care enough about the role of the DM and the great effort that the DM does to, put out her or his work, as it were, of kind of this creative thing, which may not be a work of art. I mean, it's something that's fun and entertaining in and of itself, that the DMs work really hard on creating for our players. And there's a creative process, and they really kind of like gutted that creative process, both in the makings of campaigns and also in the execution of the DM through undermining the DM's agency. So all in all, I feel that 5e is an inferior product to TSR versions of the game. Now, there are advantages to 5e. I think the best thing that WotC ever did for Dungeons and Dragons is the Ascending Armor Class system. It's a much easier way to do things. In fact, the whole D20 system is so much more elegant than the old fiddly rules of old school. And what I want to see more of is OSRs that are kind of like redos of old versions of D&D that use something more like the D20 system and have a much more streamlined set of core mechanics, but that still have the danger level of the old games and still basically are in spirit the same games. So that I think it'd be easy to take Beckley or AD&D First Edition or AD&D Second Edition and make versions of them that are D20. So in conclusion, I feel that Wizards of the Coast turned this game that's about epic quests into a game that's about telling stories about epic quests. And in the end, their product is basically just a product that's made by people who don't care about us. If all they can contribute is streamlining the rules a bit, I don't really see that as a win. So I'm going to continue to play old school D&D and the OSR. Thank you very much. All right. Hope you've enjoyed this.
Okay, so I'm not really seeing his point on a lot of things here. Like, I mean, he's got a couple of kernels of good truth in there, but there's enough bad that I think he doesn't make a great case for his stance against 5e. One, Dungeons and Dragons was always corporate. It was always profit driven. It was always designed to sell. Wizards of the Coast is just better at mass market appeal than Arneson and Gygax were. And really, TSR was, because after Gygax and Arneson was run out, and then Gygax was run out pretty early in TSR, and it was purely just like anything else. It's a profit-driven motive. It's why you make a game, is to make money, and you need mass market appeal, which is what led to the streamlining and simplifying of the rules, because making your game easy to pick up and play is important, especially in the modern society where people have such a short attention span. If these people can't figure out a new system in 5 to 10 minutes, they're done. I mean, teaching somebody to play 3.5 is a chore, and you don't get modern players who really want to do it unless they've just really been sucked into D&D. And that's because They want, pick it up, understand it, play it now. They want a tutorial that's 5 minutes, and they want to be off into the races playing their game. They don't want to have to study forever and figure out things like your THACO and ascending armor or descending armor class and different dice for absolutely everything and different kinds of proficiencies. And they don't want to figure that part out. And that's why the OSR exists for those of us who do. But he misses the point on a lot of things. There's some stuff he's just flat out wrong about, which kind of hurts his entire argument. And there's some stuff he's right about. I mean, 5th edition is geared more towards narrative gameplay and is pushing into the realm of storytelling game, which hurts it quite a bit. And all of that is because that is what WotC sees as being the mass market appeal. So you guys, forgive me for the fact that I'm kind of coffee and rambly a bit here. Like I said, I'm a little under the weather. Hopefully I can make this a little bit better with editing. But tell me what you think. What do you think about the 5th edition cut here? What do you think about his take on 5th edition? And let me know in the comment section below. I'll see you guys next time.